Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film that examines Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis and the ways in which it affects our communities, industries, and culture. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to launch this podcast series that will continue to explore issues facing the Louisiana coast through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. Polly Glover is the project coordinator for the nonprofit coastal advocacy group Restore a Retreat. Her family roots run deep in Louisiana's wetlands, with her father, John Edgar Land, involved in designing the state's first large engineered river diversion project. And now, our interview with Polly Glover. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Polly. So tell me about how you got started with Restore a Retreat and how you got involved with coastal advocacy.
Oh, okay. So, how I got started with Restore a Retreat. So last summer, I had the opportunity given to me as a private citizen to consider planting West Grand Terre, the island. And of course, as a citizen, you hopefully to get that opportunity is pretty important. They normally wouldn't give it to a private citizen. So with the CPRA inviting me to come into a scoping meeting, I called Dr. Orgeron and said, could you please sit in on a meeting? And he said, sure. And I was there in person, and Dr. Orgeron was in on a Zoom call. And we were looking at the scoping for the island because the CPRA had just finished the rebuild of the island. And we wanted to look at the possibility of a vegetative planting. And so, in the meeting, we're looking at historical documents on the island and that kind of thing. And we learned, I guess, that I had a connection to the island. It was a personal connection, that my father had built the marine lab that was there. So unbeknownst to all of us in the room, myself included, that was the start of Dr. Orgeron and I starting to figure out a game plan to restore the island and find a funding source and, determine how we were going to proceed, because I knew at that point I needed to get out there and do the work on the island.
So your interest in coastal restoration came from your dad and your family?
I guess, I certainly grew up traversing the coast, from east to west, going from Big Branch to Grand Isle, all the way west to Cameron. And of course, concerned about the environment growing up in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, knew the land loss issues we were having here in the state, which were significant. And then eventually got a little older and wanted to go out into the wetlands and plant the trees and plant the plants and restore the habitat, eventually having my own children go with me to restore the coast. Because I think I had seen with my childhood that the land was kind of disappearing before our eyes. And I think I knew probably before the general public knew that we had a land loss issue that was going to eventually take us here into the 2020s and now be of global significance with the losses here.
Right, so it's been something you've been aware of since you were young.
Yeah, I think I was probably, maybe 5 or 6 going down to Grand Isle. You'd go down on the old LA1, you'd stop on the way down at the bakery at Dufresne's and stop at the shrimp boats, and Dad would go down to do his work, and we would go down to go crab on the beach. But back then on the old LA1, when you looked on either side, you actually had land. You didn't have the wide open water that you do today. Same thing with, going west over towards Cameron. You actually had real marsh. You didn't have the broken, splintered marsh. So I definitely had an ecological awareness growing up built upon my father's career. But, you know, my concern for the wetlands, I mean, obviously I care about the coast, but I also care about the long-term sustainability.
Right. So what are some of the different projects and volunteer events that you've spearheaded with Restore Retreat? And what does that planning process entail?
Oh, that's a good one. So, you know, a year ago now, Dr. Orgeron and I commenced the effort to organize a volunteer cleanup on West Grand Terre. For the public that probably is not aware of the logistics of doing that, in addition to coordinating the volunteers going out to site, you also have to coordinate the actual site plan with regards to tidal shifting and planning what kind of vegetation you want to plant on the island that's going to foster habitat redevelopment, and also foster, you know, the return of the birds and migratory species as well as the fisheries. But the other component of it is that you also have to work around Mother Nature, and you also have to, you know, work with getting plants delivered to a barrier island, which is not one of the easiest things to do. We were fortunate enough in November on a very, very difficult day with Mother Nature arriving, with our guests coming. We had 30 volunteers come in, and we got greeted with a cold front, 52-degree air temperatures, and almost 30-knot winds blowing. But the volunteers, you know, were able to go with me and Dr. Orgeron and managed to put 8,516 plants in a little less than 6 hours. And you can tell by the smile on my face, was probably in my 30 years of planting one of the greatest volunteer events I've ever organized.
Wow.
It will stand out with me, not only because of the effort that they made, but also for the fact that they were there on the island that has certainly become a part of my family history.
Yeah. I'm curious about that. Like, obviously, it must be so gratifying to put on an event like that and see the impact that you've had. But also, what have you observed of the impact on the people who participate?
Oh, you know, I stay in touch with a lot of the volunteers. And we actually do periodic site visits, and I'll send them videos. And they're all touched at the fact that collectively, these people that perhaps didn't have an idea in their mind of the estuary and the changes that we were undergoing, or maybe they just really wanted to just volunteer that day and they didn't know what they were getting into. But here we are 8-9 months later, and they go, the island's thriving. I go, yes, the birds have returned, and the plants are now, instead of having gaps between them, the plants have now grown and are making a solid marsh ecosystem. So, you know, for the volunteers to see that, they will continue, and they still check in, and they go, that was one of the best volunteer events, because they had a chance to buy into the protection of the coast.
Right.
You know, and I think for me that day, and I've done a lot of volunteer events, okay?
Yeah.
But I think that that's one of the ones that stands out, because it was cold and it was windy and it was wet, and we had, you know, 8,516 plants.
Yeah.
And they just kind of stuck with me the whole day.
It's powerful to get that many people together.
It was, you know, we were on the island, working in the vicinity of the area that my father had worked in, and it was just such a powerful statement to see these volunteers from around the world. By the way, we had volunteers from France and Spain and all over who had seen the call for volunteers. Because about 6 weeks before the event, we put a notice out to the public saying, hey, we would love to have you join us on the island. Come out for this historic planting, because it is a historic island. And it just truly, at the end of it, we looked back, and Dr. Orgeron and I went back the next day and looked at what they had done. And it was amazing to see that 30 volunteers came and gave of their time in less than ideal conditions, actually hard conditions. And they stuck it out. And here we are 8 months later, and we saw skimmers, which are this beautiful coastal bird that we have. We saw skimmers and terns and pelicans and gulls all on the island this week when we visited.
That's incredible. So why do you think volunteerism is important in relation to the coast and just in general?
I think, to me, if you can get a volunteer out there and maybe they haven't, had the opportunity to engage in the wetlands, or maybe they have an interest in it but they just don't know much about the wetlands. I think that if I can get them out there with me, get them out there in a condition that meets their abilities, and I'm not necessarily saying stay out there in the field 8 hours, but getting them out there and getting them exposed and letting them see the environment and letting them see the rebirth of some of these barrier islands that we're doing, because that's really what it is. It's a rebirth as we rebuild these islands. And then they, are able to walk on the sediment and see the vegetation and to see the birds and to actually absorb that we're regrowing these islands. Then they actually take a buy-in, a personal buy-in, which means that they actually go home and they say, I went and did this volunteer event today and I planted X number of trees and my body's super sore, but look at what we just did. So they have that sense of giving back, which in that response, in giving back, they take ownership.
Right, you have that tangible
It
connection.
is a opportunity for them to plant the trees or plant the vegetation, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. It could be honestly hauling rocks, like I've done more than a few times for tern habitat. But whatever the engagement is, giving them that one-on-one time out there to connect and to talk with a lot of us that have been doing it for a long time. And then they take it home and they'll tell their friends, and then their friends will contact us saying, oh, when's the next event, And I need that because I'm getting up here in age now.
Yeah, it kind of gives it meaning, gives it a sense of collaboration.
Well, and I'll speak to the fact that I've raised 4 sons and they've all restored the coast with me, okay? Starting off when they were little. I've got pictures of them planting trees at 5. And they still now, as young adults, say, Mom, do you remember that time? I go, yes, I do. Do you remember the time when we sank all the way up to our chest in the floatant? Yes, I do remember that. Do you remember the time that I picked up the snake and you weren't happy? I do remember that. So they took a buy-in to it, and the need was kind of seated to protect it. And that's the goal for me, to coordinate volunteers and let them, take ownership of wanting to preserve it.
Yeah. Do you have any projects coming up that you're particularly excited about?
We do. We're hoping, once we secure funding, we're hoping to plant the next phase of West Grand Hare, which that one may get a little hard for me because that would be the site of where the Marine Lab was. We also have applied for some grants and pending funding. We've got some great opportunities to restore the coast coming up. Looking at some more barrier island restoration partnerships with some of our other NGO friends. as well as some terracing grants. All that's subject to finding the funding mechanism, but pending that, that's certainly, where we're headed, at least with the community aspect of it.
Right. And lastly, how do you think we can get more people engaged and interested in coastal restoration? Obviously, volunteering is one way to do that. But how do you get that message out and get people to want to do something like that?
I think, first of all, most of society now is so busy and hectic and caught up in their own lives. And direct community engagement, going out into the communities, listening to their needs, about their concerns for the environment around them. And so if we go to the public and we say, look, we're coming your way and we're talking about doing these projects, we'd like for you to participate. And that's really, although social media has its realm and its need, if we can go directly into the communities and one-on-one engage them in public meetings, which is a lot of what we do, is public meeting engagement, go directly to them, and usually they'll buy into the need. I will say that in my 30 plus years of advocacy, 80s and 90s, some of us knew we had a land loss issue, but it really and truly didn't become, on the radar of most citizens till right after Hurricane Katrina, and then suddenly everybody was aware that we were washing away. And then suddenly they also became aware of the cultural losses. So at that point, we started to see more volunteers getting engaged. And there's a lot of great work being done with a lot of great NGOs to engage the public. And I'm happy, of course, to work alongside it, Dr. Worsron.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, Polly.
Thank you. And I didn't get emotional. I kept it checked.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Polly Glover. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can also watch a video version of this podcast on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through grant funds from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and is executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.